Good evening, comrades. Thanks very much for joining us in tonight's session on Nasser and the Arab revolutions. Very important period in the history of the Middle East. When Nasser died in 1970, apparently there were at least 5 million people on the streets of Cairo. King Hussein and Arafat cried openly, and allegedly Gaddafi, the president of Libya, fainted twice from being so emotionally distressed. But, joking aside, the Arab Spring a few years ago, there were still hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people had their posters of Nasser on. So he's played a huge role, even and to this day, in the minds of Arab nationalism. He was a revolutionary, no doubt, and he took many measures that perhaps socialists believe were socialist measures, nationalizations, etc., but he clearly was no communist. So we're today looking at Nasser and the Arab revolutions, and we're very pleased to have with us Yassamine from Hands of the People of Iran. We'll be speaking about 50 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions and comments from the floor. Hi, thanks, Yassamine.
Thanks very much, Tina. I'm going to start by talking about the Ottoman Empire, because inevitably, in order to understand the whole nationalist movement, the officer movements that Nasser led, and also probably later about in different forms, Baasism, that started earlier than Nasser but came to power a bit later, we have to talk about the Ottoman Empire. And one thing to remember is that the Ottoman Empire was actually established in the latter years of the 13th century, 1299, if I'm not mistaken. And by 1453, Mehmet II of the Ottoman rule had conquered Constantinople and established the empire. Its decline started in the 18th century. One ruler, Selim III, was replaced by Mustafa IV. And by that time, many of the ethnic groups that were part of this vast empire had started rebelling against the treaties that the Ottoman Empire had signed, the treaties of Jassy, Lausanne, and so on. So you could say that by that stage, the war with Russia, all these defeats had created a situation where people were starting to talk about the sick man of Europe by late 18th century. But in its heydays, the empire covered from Vienna to today's Iran, and from Yemen to Algeria. It's quite a vast area, and it covered most of what we now call the Arab states, the existing Arab states. The importance of looking at the Ottoman Empire is partly also because when we consider the future of Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and so on, we have to remember this close historic background. The so-called sick man of Europe only survived because inter-imperialist conflict allowed it to survive. It had some very strange peculiarities, if you like. It called religious minorities within its own borders as millat, and that's a contradiction, because millat in millet in Turkish or millat in Persian or Arabic basically refers to nationality, while the Ottomans referred to this as people of the same religion. For example, the Jews were one millet, and the Christians were another. And the way they ruled this was that Sharia Islamic law had no jurisdiction over these millats. And these were, if you like, had their own limited levels of independence, except that they paid more taxes than the Muslims. They also had provinces that were governed by a vali. A vali is an administrator, is someone who takes charge, basically. So the country we now know as Egypt was conquered by the Ottomans in 1517. They defeated another dynasty, the Mamluks, and the governors that the Ottoman Empire imposed on Egypt was called an Ottoman Khedive. A Khedive is like a representative of the Sultan, so he was like a viceroy. And this was one of the important provinces of the Ottoman Empire, not just because of its strategic, unbelievably strategic location, in terms of north of Africa, the Suez Canal and all the rest of it, but also because of its economic power. Sections of the Ottoman Empire were not agriculturally of any use, while Egypt had cotton, grains, textiles, and they did play a part in the economy of the Ottomans. But by late 18th century, unlucky for Egyptians, it had also become an issue of interest for Britain, partly because Britain did have a very, if you like, unique view of the world in terms of access to India, passage to India, and so on. And this gateway to the Orient played an important role when Britain, under Queen Victoria or later, looked at the country. And in some ways, it became one of the first Arabic-speaking countries that saw a clear interest in terms of the British trying to win it over from the Ottoman Empire at that time under Ali Pasha. In mid-19th century, Britain started actually having a presence in Egypt. And this was because the Cairo-Alexandria Railway was extremely important. The Alexandria Railway was one of the first that the British railway companies built outside the UK. In a time when the French were competing with British in terms of investment, in terms of colonies and so on, it was the French who financed the building of the Suez Canal. It's a crucial piece of water. As you know, these days it's become so important because it connects the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And Ismail Pasha, who didn't like the French, by the way, sold Egyptian shares of the canal to the Brits in 1875. This was partly because Egypt was facing financial bankruptcy and so on. And this led to a rivalry between France and Britain. The British military actually occupied Egypt in 1882, and there was a war with French and European powers that the British won. They imposed something called the Khedival Authority in Cairo. And that's a term that is basically means a protectorate. It's a kind of protectorate. And this was coincided, this is late 19th century, it coincides with a time when Britain was also interested in ancient Egypt, in archaeology in Egypt, in tourism, in irrigation, and long term, they were also looking at agricultural benefits of Egypt, cotton in particular, which was of great interest. By the declaration of the First World War, Egypt was nominally a British protectorate. And you could say that that British actually controlled who was going to be the Khedive. So they moved one guy, moved his uncle into power. This was typical colonial maneuvering in that kind of time. And in all of this, after they put to power, the Brits put to power Hussein Kamal, he declared independence from the Ottoman Empire towards the end of the First World War. And it is in this period that you have to also think of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the division of the whole of what was left of the defeated Ottoman Empire between France and Britain. Remember that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was kept secret. No one knew about it. The only way eventually the world found out about it was that Russia, the Soviet Union, found the documents in the Tsarist Russia's documents and put them out in the world. There's another issue that we should remember, especially these days where we are bombarded with propaganda about how the West is going to liberate the women of the Middle East. And luckily, you're not a Farsi speaker, otherwise you will get all these Israeli Defense Force documents telling you that Israeli women are so liberated, unlike Muslim women in Arab countries and Iran. Well, in 1919, there were many demonstrations against Britain and against what people saw as this protectorate, this rule over foreign powers that was changing rulers, was dictating what was going on. And women played a very important role in these demonstrations. There are documents about these demonstrations. Had a number of famous leaders, such as Huda Sharawi, who died in 1947, but was one of the leading women's voices in Egypt in the first half of the 20th century. In almost an agreement between the British colonialists and the local ruler, Adil Pasha, the British Parliament agreed that after demonstrations that lasted most of the between 1919 and 1920, the British government accepted that there will be what they called independence for Egypt. This independence wasn't really what you would call real independence, although it was declared and celebrated, I think, in February 2022. But it was, at least on the surface, on appearance, was a level of independence. Everyone knew that the Brits still controlled what was going on. And in fact, military presence of Britain lasted until 1956. Their control of the kingdom was through a new royal family. And this is a pattern that exists in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, they found Brits were very good at finding tribal leaders, somebody they could put in power, and he would be their, if you like, their agents, their person. And in the case of Egypt, it was King Fuad. He died 14 years later in 1936, and King Farouk became the king of Egypt at the age of 16. And he was quite scared, and he was very much dominated by Britain. Just to give you an example, later in the late 1940s, early 1950s, the Brits arranged for his daughter to marry the Shah of Iran, ex-Shah of Iran. This was supposed to create some kind of, if you like, stronghold for the Brits. The British denied this, but it didn't seem anything but a convenient marriage of colonial powers at the time. Throughout the Second World War, British troops, as many of you will know from your grandparents, from parents, were very much involved in battles in Egypt. It was only after the war that you would see the first signs of a rebellion against Britain, what I would call anti-British feelings that had existed before the war were probably quiet during the Second World War years and then became much more powerful after that. The young Nasser was probably one of the first people from a non-aristocratic, non-bourgeois family who joined the military academy. He joined it in 1936. This was the time when Britain was trying indirectly, not in power, but indirectly was trying to create a strong army for Egypt. The Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936 had already reduced the scope of what was a semi-colonial military occupation, which had existed since the latter part of the 19th century. And Nasser and his generation, especially his cohort from the lower middle classes, were quite resentful of this constant British presence. They wanted what they called total evacuation of British forces, Egypt's full, or some of them would say real, independence. The total evacuation of British forces is, of course, something that is echoed these days in places like Iraq, where quite a lot of Iraqi people talk of the total evacuation of US forces, but that's a parallel that we might come to late. Nasser thought that it is the role of the army to expel the British, to reduce the power of their collaborators, reform their politics, and change society. And in this aspect, it was probably the events of 1948 that played an important role in his determination to lead the free officers movement. What I want to emphasize here is that he didn't have any connection to a mass movement. He never, I'm not here talking about a working class movement, but even a populist movement. He wasn't like Mossadegh, for example, in Iran, who sought parliament or democracy or people's vote in a very bourgeois nationalist way, has a role to play. He actually had this, his thoughts were very much about the fact that the army should play this role. King Farouk had reigned over Egypt from 1936 to 52. And he was important. He wasn't the leading figure, but he was important in the events leading up to the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. What is sometimes, even these days, refers to as the first Arab-Israeli War, or what the Palestinians rightly call Nakba, the forced immigration, evacuation of Palestinians from their homes, and the subsequent disasters that happened. And all this obviously followed the United Nations decision in 1947 to partition Palestine into two separate states, Jewish and Arab states. And obviously the whole idea had created a lot of tension in the area. And in the Egyptian military, there was this idea that they might be able to fight a conflict. This was supposed to be one of the larger, more resourceful armies of the region, but it was completely defeated. It was very weak. It was poorly trained. It had no modern equipment, and therefore it was one of the armies defeated in 1948, and that left a level of humiliation, a level of anger amongst young military people, but young in general, that dissatisfaction was strong. And in between the 22nd and 26th of July 1952, a group of army officers, they are called the Free Officers, who were led by two people, Jamal Abdel Nasser, one of them, and Mohammed Narim was the other one. They overthrew King Farouk, and less than a year later, they announced a new constitution and a new rule. Nasser, as you probably have seen from various books, films, and so on, became, throughout the Arab world, what you would call a charismatic leader. He was promoting, by this stage, what later was termed Arab socialism. I'm using socialism in a very, very broad term here. It was very, well, you really couldn't call it socialism, but there were some changes, some transformations that you can't deny. So before 52, 53, Egypt had an aristocratic system, a constitutional monarchy, dependence on Britain, and he changed that to what you would call probably nowadays an army republic, or a republic led by the military rather than the aristocracy who were in power before. And of course, that state in its non-monarchic system has survived, but as you probably know, it is a capitalist, private sector dominated neoliberal regime, economic system now. There was also in what Nasser produced an appeal for pan-Arab nationalism. And this pan-Arab nationalism played a very important role in the popularity he gained but also in similar movements in Syria, in Iraq, in Algeria, in Libya, in Sudan, what referred to as all these people who cried or didn't look well at his funeral. What all of these states, though, had in common was that, generally speaking, they were authoritarian states. They had quite repressive internal security systems. They policed every aspect of culture, intellectual, political life, and they were very ruthless in crushing people who opposed them. So there was the positive, if you like, anti-imperialist side, but there was the negative, repressive internal side. And here, I would say anti-colonial maybe rather than anti-imperialist, the anti-colonial aspect was more genuine than what we see now, for example, in Iran's Islamic Republic, who isn't in any way even anti-colonial, in my opinion. In most of these countries, Syria, Iraq, Algeria, in the absence of any democratic forms, in the absence of any parliamentary systems, the military were quite powerful. They were probably the most modernized, they were very well disciplined, and they had quite a lot of authority. So it was inevitable that they looked at the officers in Egypt as a model they could mimic in anti-colonial struggles. And the slogans, a bit like today, unfortunately, sometimes didn't match the reality. So Nasser often used this slogan, no voice louder than the voice of the battle. And in this, he often implied there was no voice louder than the voice of the battle against Israel. But the reality didn't match this rhetoric. And unfortunately, we see a lot of this these days. Yet, having said that, not just later, not just in the nostalgic era we live in, but even at the time, quite a lot of people who thought of themselves as Marxists, very often associated with pro-Soviet politics. Maybe they weren't members of communist parties, but they were fellow travelers of various communist parties, saw Nasser as progressive and even socialist, partly because decolonization was so important, but partly also because this section of the international left didn't want to know too much about the domestic social structures of these regimes and didn't discuss these seriously. They looked, whether directly if they were in the communist parties or indirectly if they were in non-communist parties, but still saw the Soviet Union, for example, as a deformed worker state. They saw what the Soviet Union pronounced about such regimes as positive and therefore supported them. So Egypt was, in terms of the Cold War situation, seen as being more pro-Soviet, and I will come to some of the positions they took at various times to give them that allure. Yet Nasser and quite a number of the free officers were definitely anti-communist. They weren't even like Mossadegh, who was concerned about communists, but these people were openly anti-communist. Anwar Sadat, who later was a deputy of Nasser and became later president, as well as, according to some people, Nasser himself had been close to the Muslim Brotherhood before they became free officers. Now, you have to see that this wasn't a religious tendency towards that. It was more of anti-colonial behavior. So you have to be more maybe agnostic about how this happened. When the officers took power, a number of low-ranking officers who were close to what was at the time called the Marxist Democratic Movement for National Liberation of Egypt supported the coup. Initially, this was very early days, and the Muslim Brotherhood supported the coup. But this didn't last long, and I think within a year, both sides faced imprisonment. In the case of Muslim Brotherhood, they built actually their base on, if you like, complaints about repressions that they faced and so on. The officers also didn't have a good relationship with the working class. They did break, and as far as I know, a number of people were killed in conflict with striking workers in Alexandria, which again is something we have seen after the Arab Spring, when Sisi came to power, and even when the Muslim Brotherhood at times had to confront these people. So in 1952, there are reports of the army attacking worker strikes. There are examples of firing squads used against workers who were demonstrating and so. And I think there was also another important factor for the officers to try and show themselves to be anti-communist. And one of them was to appease the US Embassy in order to confirm that they weren't pro-Soviet. Later, they did become more of the so-called socialist camp, part of what was laughingly called the non-capitalist road to development. But at the time, I think they were very, very keen to show the US, which a lot of third world countries, global South countries at the time, had a lot of illusions about in the early 1950s. They saw US as more progressive than Britain, less colonial. And so the Egyptian military were a junta, the officers in power were very keen, as was Mossadegh, to be honest, to show the US that they weren't communists. I think one of the lasting legacies of the era must be the agricultural reforms. This was quite important. The majority of the country was an agrarian country. The majority of the population were poorly nourished. They were illiterate. They were often affected by serious disease. This is prior to the overthrow of the monarchy. And there were very few, as in most of these countries, few thousand large landowning families. This was true of Iran, Iraq, many of these countries, who owned not just the land, but also owned households, rural households, who worked as either wage laborers or fedan, as owners of plot of less than 1 fedan, which was not enough for subsistence, and therefore were owned by larger landowners. So the free officers' success, I suppose, is eliminating to a certain extent this large landowning class, the feudalism of the era, and modest land reforms. You have to say that all of these land reforms that happened in the 1950s, in some cases in the early 1960s, can at best be described as very modest. They did improve the situation for the landless and the small land-owning peasants, but they didn't change the situation dramatically. And long-term, quite a lot of these people couldn't survive in the rural areas and became the shantytown dwellers of Cairo and other major cities. Despite all this, and despite his, if you like, military backgrounds, Nasser was certainly convinced that he spoke for ordinary people. And he often said that he has these kind of quotes that he repeats at various speeches. And he often used to say, "Lift up your head, my brother." This was one of his regular quotes, implying that he associated himself with an ordinary person. In many ways, you could say that there was the problem with all of this, with the exception of the agricultural minimum wage and the reduction of power of major landowners, there was no coherent economic policy. It wasn't just that these people weren't communist or socialist. They really didn't have any form of ideology of any kind. They didn't have a plan. They didn't know how they were going to maintain power long term. And, you know, in many ways, if you think that Sadat was the immediate successor of Nasser, Mubarak was the immediate successor of Sadat, you can see that this lack of coherent policy, political ideology, of any type of coherent economic policy, has managed to move from what was a statist type of economy to a neoliberal one in a very short period. Nasser was also very good as outmaneuvering all of his opposition. He had rivals within the officers' group, but by 1954, he had secured his position. He also had quite a standing in international and regional policies. So he was one of the, and here you have to give the positive side as well as the negative side. He was obviously one of the first leaders of the region who supported the Algerian national liberation as early as, I think, November 1954. He gave the FLN a voice using powerful radio stations that Egypt broadcast in Arabic to all the Arab countries. It had quite a range in terms of accessibility. And I think it was called Voice of the Arabs, if I'm not mistaken. And he was using that not just about FLN, but also to directly talk to Arabs outside Egypt, and at times over the heads of their own government. So he was very keen to call for rebellion against the Baghdad Pact. Those of you who don't remember the Baghdad Pact, this was the British and the Americans had created an anti-Soviet pact. Iran of the Shah was obviously part of it. I think Turkey and Iraq had joined it. So, but they managed, for example, to stop Jordan and Lebanon to joining the Baghdad Pact. And at the time, in the 1950s, this was important. Nasser saw himself as a third world leader, and I think his if you like, claim to fame in some ways on the international scene was when he went to the Bandung conference that was called by Sukarno. At the time, India, China, India's Zhou Enlai was there, China's Nehru was there, and he started this rhetoric about anti-colonialism, non-interference in other countries' affairs. So 1955 was, if you like, him launching himself on the international stage. The debates about the Suez Canal had been going on. In 1956, the World Bank withdrew a previous offer they had already made to the Egyptian government to finance the Aswan Dam. And this was the US had told the World Bank that's what they had to do. And Nasser nationalized the privately owned Suez Canal Company. And this is the beginning of the Suez crisis, which led to, at a very crucial time when the FLN war was going on, when there were other rebellions against British presence in other Arab countries, this became the Suez Crisis, as you know. In some ways, he made his name because his decision to nationalize the Suez Canal apparently was his decision. There was no consultation with other people, but in some ways he survived that, and that made him quite a figure in the Arab world, because this was the first time anyone had actually managed to do something, if you like. In 1958, Egypt joined what was then the Republic of Syria and annexed the Gaza Strip, which was ruled by what was the old Palestine government. So the Syrian-Egyptian alliance was called the United Arab Republic, and it existed until 1961. Egypt still called itself, until the death of Nasser, United Arab Republic, but the reality was it didn't last after 61. And here again, I want to emphasize this whole historic Ottoman legacy with what we are facing even now, where in some ways, when you look at something like Palestine, you have to realize that the plight of the Palestinians is so interwoven with the plight of people in Syria and Egypt and the region. And that, in my opinion, makes some of the arguments put forward by Moshe Machover far more plausible than those who have this narrow bourgeois democratic view of a single state, as opposed to obviously the illusions of a two-state solution. Beyond the Middle East, Nasser had some influence. So he joined India and Yugoslavia to create what was called the non-aligned movement. And in some ways, this wasn't completely non-aligned, because by creating this alliance, they were already trying to confront the US, but they also didn't want to be part of, if you like, the socialist camp. But this whole alliance, the non-aligned movement, had its allies, had its supporters. I don't think in the current situation where we are looking at single polar hegemon powers destroying an entire region, it is easy to be nostalgic for the non-aligned movement, but it never was really non-aligned, and it wouldn't have existed or survived except with the tolerance of the Soviet Union, and that in itself was not necessarily very positive. And hopefully in the discussion we can talk about some of that. Nasser's nationalization was in response. I mean, he went he used lots of slogans in advertising why he was nationalizing the Suez Canal. He called it a symbol of despotism, great humiliation, and he actually calculated that the money that Egypt could get from the Suez Canal would be far more than what the World Bank could offer, and so. We have to remember that this period of the mid-1950s also coincided with a Franco-Israeli alliance, where actually Britain joined this Franco-Israeli alliance, what became known as the tripartite aggression, according to the Egyptians. And Israel conquered the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, and had and proclaimed the idea, the decisions that it would annex these territories. It was the US and the Soviet Union that forced Israel to withdraw. And in some ways, it looked as if this was mainly a US-Soviet agreement, but it looked as if Egypt had come out of this quite well. And in some ways, that was what paved the way for this alliance with Syria. In terms of Arab socialism, I think there is the only signs that you can talk of a very superficial socialism is when Nasser started nationalizing the property of British, French, Belgian nationals after this tripartite aggression. And as a result of this, following this, he also, because some of the local bourgeois owners refused to accept the rule of Nasser, he nationalized Banca Mesr. Mesr is Egypt in Arabic. He nationalized that, and using what was very Soviet-style policy, he started what became known as a 5-year plan. What one can say about Arab socialism or African socialism or any of these, what I would call anti-Marxist varieties of socialism in the third world, is that they followed the economic development of the Soviet model. They were following rapid industrialization, which inevitably did mean an increase, a raise in the level of consumption of the popular classes, but there was not enough power to have a serious radical agrarian policy. And both in Egypt, but also in other Arab socialist countries, these officers could not manage to mobilize the peasants, who were at the time, no longer is that the case, but who were at the time the majority of the population of the country, into any struggle against the Ancien regime. And that, in a way, was the defeat, was the failure of these Arab socialists. Quite a lot of the modern working class did support them. The state bureaucrats did support them. They did manage a level of stable employment. They did create healthcare and pensions, but all this for the urban section of the population. And all of this was really the limits of Nasserism, of Arab socialism. So definitely the relations of labor capital did not change. Military authoritarianism replaced the nepotism of the private sector. Rich peasants became richer, poor peasants became agricultural wage workers. And if you look at most of these Arab socialist countries, you can't see any difference between them. The Nasser regime did also imprison Egyptian socialists, communists. Many were sent into exile. Those who did stay did face prison camps. And interestingly, throughout this period, the Soviet Union was doing very little on the subject. Those of you who have heard of Samir Amin will know that he was a communist exile from Egypt. There were many others like him. And the same was true of what I would call the alliances between Nasser and Syria. So that wasn't any different. So the crucial times that I also want to refer to was is the war in 1967. It's a very important role. Nasser supported Abdul Hakim Amer, who was one of Nasser's closest allies, and they both led what ultimately, according to some, provoked the war of 1967. Israel attacked Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in June 1967, and the defeat of the Egyptian forces was considerable. You could say that Israel didn't need any provocation, and that's probably true. So history would judge the defeat as a lack of preparation rather than a provocation. Nasser was so devastated by the defeats that he actually offered to resign. But according to what I've read, masses appeared on the streets. And there's two views of this, a bit like the current Sisi pro-Palestinian demonstrations. There's always good reason to believe that it was Nasser's lieutenants, his allies, that orchestrated these demonstrations. Please don't resign. In the case of Sisi, please stand and be the president for another N years and maybe for life. But it could be that there was a level of genuine support for him as well. So in some ways, the defeat of 67 also reduced Nasser and Arab socialism's international standing. This was a crushing defeat, not just for Egypt, but also for Syria. And I think the Arab New Left very much felt this. So it's in this period that we see, for example, the two Marxist Palestinian groups rising, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There is quite a lot to say about Nasser and the Palestinian movement. I will leave it to the Q&A because I realize I'm talking for far too long. I'm briefly going to talk about his legacy. I think the first demonstrations against the Nasser regime by workers and students was as early as 1954. And you can say that various forms of protests existed all the way until 1967, when it became far more of a serious protest movement. He definitely, you can say, represented the aspirations of a generation of the mid-20th century, who were, if you like, the generations that were adults in the mid-20th century, who wanted development, who wanted fast development for the global South, who were definitely anti-colonial, and who thought, with no justification, I must say, that they represented the masses. No justification in that, by definition, by being army officers, they had not even gone through a bourgeois parliamentary system. They had no base. Their base was achieved after they came to power, and through populism, through use of media, radio, presence on the streets and so on, of gaining this kind of popular support. So I would very much question their claims that they represented the people in the street. There's two aspects that I haven't covered in all this. And one is the attitude of the Nasser regime towards the Egyptian Communist Party and the Palestinians. They're two separate issues that require more time. And I'm conscious that I've talked for a long time. The one thing I would say is that it was the Soviet Union's fraternal relations, and at times, in the case of Egypt, almost uninterrupted close relations with the Nasser regime that devastated the future of the Communist Party. In other countries that followed the same type of Arab socialism, where Baasism came to power, in particular in Iraq and Syria, it was far worse in that the Soviet Union followed a policy of at times supporting the Baasist regime and at times being against the Baasist regime, depending on where they flipped in their relations between the US, the West, and the Soviet Union, and therefore contradictory messages to these communist parties, in particular in Iraq, devastated the left, destroyed the left in so many ways. In the case of Iraq, it led to a major split in the Iraqi Communist Party. And if you like, all of this paved the way, not deliberately by Arab socialism, but as a consequence, if you like, of Arab socialism and the Soviet Union's special relations with these types of countries, that it played a part, I'm not saying the crucial part, but played a part in the lack of popularity, the inability to survive of the left in many of these countries. And of course, the fact that Islam became a revivalist force once these so-called nationalist, Arab socialist, whatever you want to call them, governments lost popularity, is partly again to do with the authoritarian ways they dealt with the left, the authoritarian ways they dealt with working class struggles, and the ways that at times they used the Palestinian question for opportunist and, if you like, survival reasons. And many of these are, of course, to be debated, but I'll leave it at that. And I hope I will have a chance to talk about Nasserism and the Palestinian case as well. Thank you.
Wow, well, thank you very much, Yasmin. That was very thorough and very, very deep understanding of how special Nasser was as well, wasn't it? He's quite just USSR. I mean, there was at different times, Eisenhower during the Suez crisis, that is interesting. He told, I mean, you mentioned that he told Israel, Britain, and France to get out and let the Suez Canal back to Nasser, basically. And then that changed later as well when they tried to build up King Hussein against the Saudi Arabia as a counterbalance to Egypt and Nasser, etc. So it's a really interesting, really important history in that. It's also interesting his relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. If anybody's reading up about that went up and down and up and down and up and down on Wikipedia. Actually, if anybody wants to look at it, it's very funny. There's a video where he's telling an audience about his attempt to have come to an arrangement with Muslim Brotherhood, and he's got a meeting with the leader, and that he's chuckling away when he says, "Well, they want me to basically put a hijab on every single woman in Egypt," and the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, whose daughter goes to medicine school, he can't even do it to his own daughter, and you expect me to do it to 10 million women, and he's chuckling away, and the audience is in hysterics. It's quite interesting. There's a lot of videos on our page. It's quite good. Comrades, if you have a question or want to make a contribution, please click raise hand. I'm sure we can get back to the question of the Palestine question. What I was going to ask you though is reading through some of the stuff he did after he took power, and you mentioned that obviously, it's very good, he's anti-colonial, and he overthrew, he chucked out the British and nationalized the Suez Canal, etc. He'd compensated, by the way, the shareholders, so it wasn't quite, we just take it away from you. But in terms of what then happened, I mean, the few times he did stand for elections, for example, he was the only candidate. He banned, first he nationalized, first he put quite restrictions on the press, and then he basically nationalized it all. So there was no free press. He banned political parties. As you say, he also was quite authoritarian and stuff against the Communist Party, etc. Now, some people on the left think that kind of stuff has to happen after a revolution. If you have a revolution and there's people standing up against it, you need to ban political parties. You need to ban the press. You can't have the counter-revolution. Revolution is organizing and trying to take it all away from you. Sort of in your assessment, how do you see, I mean, a communist revolution, a socialist revolution, should we be banning parties afterwards? Should we be banning the press?
That's a very good question. I mean, what I would argue is that this wasn't a revolution. I mean, I know it's called the Egyptian Revolution, but what you could say was a military coup in some ways. And by definitions, military coups have different agenda. So if you have a genuine revolution, surely by that stage, you must have the overwhelming support of the population, the majority of the population. In a coup, you don't need to. You're the military, you depose a king, you come to power. And that defines Baasism and Nasserism, because that's what the Baasists did to the king in Iraq and in Syria. And in some ways, that's a whole different agenda, because first of all, by being officers, you already if you like, part of an authoritarian military setup, and you carry this on into your future, in your new role. And that's exactly what these people did. I think quite a lot of the support they gained was long after the so-called coup, and through various populist actions and the world situation. So no, you can't. If you start doing that, you have a return of the previous order. But even if you don't have the return of the previous order, you're paving the way to the preparation of a situation where the most reactionary but financially or foreign supported opponents are in a better position to replace you than, if you like, the people who come, who are asking for more rights. So you have two types of opponents after a change. On the one hand, you have people who want basic rights, like the communists who wanted better land reform or something. And on the other, you have the supporters of the ancien regime. But a coup has its own definitions of how you do. And these people were part of a coup. They weren't revolutionaries, I would say, but maybe I'm being harsh. I can't hear you, so.
Sorry, I unmuted myself. I was going to ask you a question as well that came up in the chat, and I was going to ask you about as well. Is the what's the solution for the situation? And somebody said, how did you just say the one state and two state solution are bourgeois? Because a lot of people believe, one state and with democratic rights for everybody. That sounds like a good solution. Why do you say that's not really very realistic?
Okay, so I'm a convert to this because I supported most of my life the one-state solution. The reason I would say that is that if it happens under a bourgeois system, what are you going to tell the Israeli working class? I think Moshe Machova makes a very good point that the Israeli working class is in a good position right now. So in order to win them over, you have to say, this is not the same as South Africa, where the workers were Black and the owners of capital were white. There is an Israeli working class. They are privileged, they are colonial working class, but there is an Israeli working class. So what would be their advantage in a one-state solution? They would lose their privileges of the current colonial state. So if you were talking of a one-state solution, which I still believe it has to be no division in terms of states based on religion, you would need a more regional solution, and that regional solution requires social revolutions. The overthrow, the alliance of the working class in the countries such as Syria, Jordan, what the history of Nasser actually shows you was very much velayats within the Ottoman Empire with no defined borders. Palestine was part of the, if you like, the Syrian governorate. And so the plight of the Palestinian working class is very much involved incorporated in the plight of the Jordanian and the Syrian working class. And you would need to look at social revolutions that had the overthrow of those regimes and capitalism in that area. Otherwise, a bourgeois democratic one-state solution, a bourgeois liberal, bourgeois liberal one-state solution is not realistic. We can call for it, we can demand it, but it's not a realistic solution, in my opinion. And I think Moshe Machova has explained it very well, much better than I can. But there is this problem that you need to have, I think in a regional social revolution, the Israeli working class will see its future being in that single state.
Okay, thank you. If anybody wants to carry on with that discussion, please click raise hand and we can have somebody with an opposing view. Anne, hi.
Hi, thank you. I'm early into the debate because there was a couple of things I really wanted to ask about that have been on my mind recently. So like everybody else, I've been trying to read around the subject, and one of the books that I'm in the process of reading at the moment is Abay Shlem's memoir, a Jewish Arab, isn't an Arab Jew. I can't remember exactly the title, but basically about him, his life, his family being Jews in I'm just trying
Iraq,
to
in Baghdad.
Iraq, exactly. Sorry, I'm just having it in Iraq and moving when he was 5 to Israel. And in fact, so far anyway, the book has really been about examining history, broader history, rather than his life. So what really interested me was a couple of things. And one of them was the Arab Republic, the United Arab Republic, the Syrian, Egyptian, Gazan Republic, because, well, it sort of interested me because I thought that knowing more about that might give me more insight into the connections between the peoples of the region. Because I do actually also agree with Yasmina, and Musha has convinced me too, of the need for us to look at the region, look at the question of Palestine on a regional basis. I don't know that I think that it's something that has to be left for socialism. For me, when people say to me it needs to be one state or two state, I would argue it needs to be about self-determination, and it has to be about Palestinian self-determination, including the right to return. And I think, given the way things are, that division is, has to happen unless there is a huge shift, which doesn't seem immediately viable. So that's the first thing. I just think it's very interesting, and like why it collapsed and how what it was like when it existed. And maybe, I mean, I know that this is just one talk and there's a lot to discuss, so it would be maybe an idea if there was any more reading material you could point to understand that. So I think that it's useful for us not to talk about the one state or two state solutions. I think it's useful for us to get to know the region and the dynamics in the region and the histories of the people of the region. And one thing I think is also interesting is that you look at the fact that it was an empire. Within the empire, there was certain autonomy and there were certain rights for minorities. You look at the Tsarist Empire and you look at the connections between people and the certain level of autonomy also that existed in the Russian Empire, simply because there was this, center which was very far away from everything, and people in the regions lived often quite autonomously. Of course, they would get their visits from the Tsarist police, etc., but the dynamics and the boundaries and the connections between people were different to those in Europe. Anyway, and then just the last thing I wanted to say was about the influence of the Soviet Union, because it seems to me, listening to you, that the economic development was what was at the core of Nasserism. So therefore, it was like an enlightened group of officers that took power, and they were going to give socialism to the people by giving them, the kind of economic advantages that perhaps they wouldn't have had in earlier times, make them more secular, make them more urban, develop them in that way. And that definitely is like a Soviet policy. And the fact that there was little or no democracy, or indeed that it was accepted that this regime was socialism of some kind, although there was no democracy, seems to me to be clear evidence of the kind of society that the Soviet Union was, and the kind of program it was putting forward for others to follow. And that in a way what the Arab states did by kind of having like the opportunity for self-determination at a later stage was in choosing socialism. They kind of got this kind of socialism, rather than perhaps if they had the opportunity at an earlier stage in around the Russian Revolution, it would have been different. And then like when you look at Afghanistan and the coming to power in 1978 of like, again, with the coup of army officers in Afghanistan, I'm just wondering whether you see like any kind of connection with a similar approach of introducing secularism and socialism from above, again, with not much in the way of democracy. So, okay, there's quite a lot there, but yeah, it was so interesting, so interesting. I wish I could sit you down for a week and talk to you about it, and I will sometime maybe. So interesting. Thank you so much.
And Yasmin, do you want to reply straight away?
Just a very quick comment on the kind of Arab socialism versus Afghanistan. So cynically, the Soviet Union didn't even consider these to be Arab socialists, right? While Afghanistan was different because the Khalq and Parcham were part of the Soviet brother parties. So there is a big difference. In terms of these countries, and here we're talking of Iraq, Syria, Egypt, all the rest of it, the emphasis was on these terms that they had evolved in the Soviet Union, the non-capitalist road to development. It was absolute nonsense. They didn't think this was socialism, right? All that the non-capitalist road to development meant was that they weren't part of the US client states. That's all they were worried about. There is a difference, again, I mean, I don't like any of the factions of the Afghan Communist Party, Parcham, Khalq, whatever, but there is a difference in that at least they pretended to parrot the vocabulary of socialism. Nasser didn't. Nasser was very clear. He was anti-communist, and the Russians, the Soviet Union, were well aware that he was anti-communist. He actually, just before the Suez crisis, when he wanted the US as an ally, he kept going around to the US embassy saying, look, we are anti-communists. You know, he literally said that. So I think there is a distinction, and it shows the opportunism of the Soviet Union, that even the brother parties that were full supporters of the Soviet line were sold out for the sake of these reactionary, authoritarian nationalists, because the main issue was not socialism by that stage. The main issue was the survival of the socialist camp. That had become, I mean, democracy didn't play a role in any of these. Obviously, after Stalin, there couldn't have been any talk of that. But what was very important was that they had no illusions. They couldn't care less about these. And remember, the Nasser attack on strikes was not something that people didn't know about. They knew about it. And the Soviet Union just thought that didn't matter. I'm sure Egyptian Communist Party people were actually told either shut up or leave the country or you'll be arrested and we are not going to defend you. That's what happened in Iraq, where the Communist Party basically was told to shut up and put and that was their policy. In terms of Islam, it's important to remember what he's saying, which is crucial in the history of the whole immigration of Jews from Arab countries. So we are constantly told these stories that the Jewish population in Iraq, for example, were bombed out of Baghdad. And his book is amazing in that he explains how the two events that are referred to historically as pogroms are actually, one is a bombing organized by the British Embassy, and the other is a bombing organized by Mossad. This is to encourage the Jews of Iraq to leave Iraq. And he's a very thorough man. I know him very well. He's a very thorough historian. He's not saying these off the top of his head. He's gone and looked at archives. He's read all the details as his book references of what people said about what happened in Baghdad in the 1950s. And it is the Nasser era, so it's relevant to refer to.
Thank you, Yasmin.
Thank you.
Matthew.
Yeah, just a few things. I mean, the thing about Nasser, of course, is that obviously he does have the real advantage of dying at the right time. You know, when he dies in 1970, you know, before he does anything particularly awful, and it's, you know, his contemporary Sadat, who's in the same association, the same set of politics, goes off and does a deal with the Israelis and so on. So Nasser, of course, gets this enormous funeral, which 6 million people turn out, you know. And he's also, of course, he's lucky in Suez, isn't he? Because obviously Suez is a lash up between the French, the Israelis, and the British. Which is stopped by the Americans, who turn around to the British and say, "Well, you can't do this. We'll collapse the pound, because you know you said to us you're going to be an ex-colonial power, and you can't suddenly turn around and just decide to start taking over bits of the world again, because we run the world now and you don't." So you know, the British had to do a runner. So in that sense, I mean, history treats him very well. Even though he died at the age of 52. I think that the interesting contrast, actually, as you say, in terms of, you know, the army taking over as a coup against Farouk, who was pretty awful, is Iraq, of course, because Iraq was a popular revolt and did throw out the Hashemites by means of a popular revolt, which is then stopped by effectively, you know, the army taking over itself, and then of course Saddam, who was a CIA man, you know, and the sergeant in charge of the Ba'ath Death Squad, an interesting character in those terms. So it's this sort of contrast between those two, you know, that obviously you do have a real popular revolt in Iraq, but it is prevented from taking power by the army. In terms of Israel, I mean, the interesting thing about Israel, of course, is that in current circumstance, I mean, part of this war that's going on at the moment, of course, is about the disintegration of the politics of Israel as it stands. I mean, the thing is about the Israeli working class at the moment, of course, is that Israel is a deeply unequal society. And the working class, of course, has been suffering, you know, an increasing level of poverty over the past period. And the revolt against Netanyahu and included general strikes. I mean, despite the fact that obviously the trade union, Histadrut, which is completely integrated into the systems of government and Zionism, attempted to stop this from happening, the actual working class said, right, okay, no, we're out of here. You know, we're stopping work because we don't put up with this stuff. Now, the question really then becomes, obviously, okay, well, if you want democracy, then obviously you can't have Zionism too, you know, and you can't have the occupation of millions of people, because obviously, you know, if you want a democracy, you can't sit run an occupation regime at the same time. You can have one or the other. Now, I mean, most people, I mean, a lot of people I know will say, well, you know, they're all evil colonialists and we shouldn't bother with them. But obviously there's a class dynamic here. And the question was to put that, you know, put that question. Some people did. I mean, okay, they had a very hard time doing it, but they did it. And okay, we might not agree with them because a lot of them were around the Hadash and so on, but that was the correct thing to do, and we should recognise it. So, I mean, in those terms, I think you're right to open the debate about, should it be bourgeois a bourgeois democracy in Palestine? Should it, because obviously such a thing under current circumstance in which obviously the whole questions of capitalism are disintegrating themselves. That's correct to raise that question. I can't think that I've come up with a position on it at this point, but I think it's a correct question to raise. Thanks.
Do you want to reply to that, Yasmin?
Well, sorry, Rebecca, just a couple of short comments. I think one of the problems is that the Israeli opinion has hardened against Palestinians since 8th of October. And in some ways, that's what the polls show. Maybe they're wrong, but that's what the polls show. So although the opposition to the judicial changes that the extreme right-wing government is proposing is still there and will definitely pick up as soon as there is a level of normality, if one can achieve that. But unfortunately, the polls show a hardening of Israeli citizens' views about the future of Palestine. But I don't know, and that's a different, I mean, we are speculating on that, and maybe the polls are wrong. One thing that I do want to talk about is, because it relates to the Nasser era and Egypt's rule of Gaza, because one of the many horrible solutions proposed by various people, in addition to all the Palestinians of Gaza moving to various European countries, is why don't there's these proposals that Zionists are putting forward of them becoming part of Egypt. Now, those Gazans who have a memory of the 1940s and 50s will remember that this wasn't a great time either. For example, there is historic reasons to believe that during Nasser's time, when he had inherited, this is between 48 and 67, so 52 to 67, when he had inherited the charge of Gaza from the previous monarchy, there was this pretense of Palestinian sovereignty, but that was not real, and Egypt had full control, economic and political control. And in some ways, they were not offered Egyptian citizenship, for example. They were kept in camps as political and propaganda tools against Israel, but they were never, their situation economically did not improve. They had a number of Egyptian governors who were quite heavy-handed in terms of political freedoms, imposing restrictions on the Gazan population. And of course, things got a lot worse after June 67. I'm not saying that, but if you like, the vision of the best time under Nasser's Egypt for Gazans is a dark time. God knows what would happen if we had Sisi governance of Gaza. It would be, not that he's volunteering, from what I can gather, and many people have commented on this, the Egyptian government is saying, no way, we will have nothing to do. And if these people move towards Egypt, we will actually shoot them. So that's not a possible solution, but here you are. The history doesn't look good either.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thanks, Matthew. Ian next.
Thank you. Good evening, comrades, and thank you, Yasmin. It was a brilliant presentation, fascinating throughout. I just wanted to ask about the balance of forces in not only Israel, but all the nations surrounding. The idea of a regional solution is predicated upon there being a class that's capable of taking power. For example, in Egypt today, I presume that would have, outside of Israel, a substantial proletariat. But it's a proletariat which wouldn't necessarily move in the direction of socialism. What are the chances, for example, of the Brotherhood taking power in the event of some kind of upheaval, perhaps as a consequence of what's happening in Israel, Palestine, perhaps in the consequence of, God forbid, millions of people being driven into the Sinai Desert. And then, of course, Jordan, which is often presented as a kind of island of stability, particularly in the West, is portrayed in that way because the dynasty there is a British placeman. Presumably there is some kind of proletariat in Jordan, but the extent to which it would unify behind the idea of a regional solution or even any kind of socialist solution, I mean, I simply have no way of knowing, and I would be interested in your view. Other countries, of course, Syria and Iraq, have been so destroyed. Much of the population seems to be déclassé, from what I've read, and it may be quite faulty. But something like 70% of men being looking out of work or underemployed or whatever, where joining a militia seems like a reasonable career choice. At least it'll ensure some supply of bread. Under those circumstances, whilst I think it's probably the best possible solution, a regional one, what are our chances?
Good question.
Very good question. And I don't pretend I necessarily have the answer, but a couple of points. Muslim Brotherhood came to power and didn't manage to maintain power, not just because of the coup. The coup was part of it, but Muslim Brotherhood lost its shrine when it was in power. I was in Egypt just before and during the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, and ordinary people were saying, these people are corrupt. They're associating with big technological telecom companies. Ordinary people in the street who didn't know what multinationals, but were telling me, look, you see this advert for telecom companies. It's a Saudi-owned company. The Muslim Brotherhood is in collaboration with them. They're exploiting us. Our poverty is because of that. So I don't think you should see, and I'm not underestimating the possibility of Muslim Brotherhood gaining power in any of these countries, but you should not underestimate if you like, the level of information that ordinary people, ordinary working class people in Egypt or Iraq or Syria now have because of the connected world we all live in on the economic policies of people like the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood has a base, but that base is really tarnished, is really defeated. There isn't a left. That is the problem. There isn't a viable left in Egypt, and that's a serious issue. And no one can pretend that this will be achieved overnight. But what I am saying is that the Egyptian working class should not be underestimated. This is a working class that did fight against Nasser, did fight against the Muslim Brotherhood. There were the same Alexandria cotton factories that fought against Nasser also fought against the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were the first strikes against Sisi's government. So we should not underestimate the history of these countries and the fact that some of these countries had communist parties in 1919. The first meeting of the Egyptian Communist Party took place in 1919. Iraq had one of the largest communist parties of the region. And yes, it is true that the working class is decimated in Iraq and Syria, but there is still a working class. You can't deny that that working class exists. I mean, in Iraq, the youth are actually in a very active anti-sectarian movement. The things that unite the under 25s, if I understand it correctly, in Iraq, is their hatred of sectarianism. And both the Muslim Brotherhood and the Shia sects that support Iran are seen as the enemy. And that is a very positive development in a country where there shouldn't be such divisions. So I think I'm not saying that socialism is on the card. I'm not saying communist parties are on the verge of gaining power. But I think sometimes because the West is portraying the Middle East as this, if you like, scorched earth area where nothing exists, is either the liberator, the wonderful US Army and the IDF, or the Islamists who are barbarian. We all, inevitably, me included, only see these two poles, but the reality is more complex, and that reality has chances. It has limited chances, but given that the US is not exactly in a position to do much against Houthis, never mind, I don't know anybody in Iraq or Syria, then it's not as hopeless, maybe, as we might think. And I am encouraged by what I see in the demonstrations. So in Amman, for example, the demonstrators throughout the Gaza events since the 8th of October, the demonstrators are shouting, "We are all Palestinian." You know? They're not saying we're Jordanians supporting, but because they are Palestinians, they're actually, there's 25 million Palestinians outside the borders of the occupied territories. It's a large number. And Jordan is a country where it's the most unstable. I do agree with you that the British press is presenting him as the only steady hand he's the most unstable government in the region. Let me give you an example why he's unstable. The Jordanian government seconded South Africa's motion to ICJ, the International Court. Now, if you told me this a year ago, I would have fallen off my chair. Why is the Jordanian king doing this? Because he's scared. He's scared of his own population. And in some ways, when you have people in large numbers in Amman demonstrating, saying, "We are all Palestinian," when you have a few million, I've never seen a demonstration like that in Sana'a, in Yemen, of people saying, "We support Palestinians." You do see that this isn't today's development, that people identify with Palestine as an internal issue, not as a solidarity issue. They see this struggle as their struggle. And that's why there can be a regional solution, because people don't see it as solidarity. Iran is different. Iran is opportunist, in my opinion, in its attitude towards Palestine. And most Iranians don't feel part of this because they don't consider themselves Arabs, never mind pro-Palestinian. But in Amman, in Damascus, in Baghdad, but definitely also in Cairo and in Riyadh, people do see the Palestine issue as a day-to-day issue. It's not, for the last 70 years, it has been an important issue for the people of the region. So uniting them on this issue is important, because every time the Iraqis have failed, Nasser has failed, every time anyone has failed, their argument has been, we can't do much because we are fighting for Palestinians. Well, they were actually doing deals with Israel in secret. Yeah, so it's an integral part of bringing down these governments, and people see it as that. They don't see it as, something the Jordanian king can do. They don't see it as something that bin Salman can achieve. They see it as part of their struggle to bring down the King of Jordan. Now, how vastly this will be is a difficult one to say. I think Saudis and the Persian Gulf countries have their own issues. There are differences there. But I would say Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and probably Egypt are so involved in the Palestinian question. You need to look at it in that way.
Thank you. Last person from the floor is Steve. You're muted.
I think I've unmuted myself, haven't
There you are. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got some screen thing up there. There we go. Get rid of that. That's the best way. Oh, what's happening now?
You can speak. We can hear you. All good.
We can hear.
Yeah, no, sir. I've just I've just kind of lost focus here. Hang on a minute. No, I can't even see myself.
We can see you. All good. You don't have to see yourself.
Okay, back to meeting. Oh yeah, well I like to see myself. I see what my mouse doing. Yeah, see if it works with my brain. That's always a good thing if that's going together in coordination. Anyway, thank you, Yassamine. If socialists have got nothing to say about one state or two states, that is a waste of time, struggling either for one state or two. And I'm totally opposed to two states as an argument, by the way, and I agree with you. But what you said was that the call for a single state, we could call for a single state, we could demand it, but then you said it's not realistic. And I don't mean, do you mean it's not achievable? It cannot be achieved, one state, in which case, if it's not achievable, then don't call for it. Then there's no point in wasting time in that sense. And I agree with it. But surely the question that we have to talk about in all of these cases is the question of having a democratic revolution in the territory of Israel and Palestine from the river to the sea. Because that's the struggle that's actually going on there, involving people. And you can think the idea of a democratic secular republic. Secularism is an absolutely crucial question in all of this. The problem of Zionism, which is an anti-democratic idea, the idea of self-determination, the idea of having a constituent assembly, which the Trotskyists always raised in the past, the right of return, the end of arbitrary imprisonment, torture, the freeing of political prisoners, which is a big issue amongst Palestinian people, the end of house demolitions, free speech, having elections. All these issues are all bouncing around there in the area of Israel and Palestine. And it's not to isolate that revolution from democratic revolutions in other parts, because you could have a democratic revolution in Iran, different sorts of democratic issues, in Egypt, in Jordan. I mean, it's one thing to say in Jordan, we're all Palestinians, i.e. solidarity, they're saying, with the Palestinian people. But as you pointed out, what about a democratic revolution in Jordan? Do they want to get rid of the Jordanian king and the Jordanian ruling class? So I think I've understood the idea of democratic revolution doesn't stand on its own. It's part of a permanent revolution. So we should be talking about democratic revolutions in Egypt, in Iran, in Jordan, etc. Now, those things are all connected together, but we shouldn't set that against what's happening in Israel and Palestine. So I think we have to have a focus on that. We have to have an idea of how that struggle for democracy can come to fruition, can be won, as it were. And that means that the key role to be played by the Israeli and Palestinian working class. Now that's the question, are they ruled out? Do we see the Israeli and Palestinian working class as a force for democracy in that area? I understand the argument that a section of the Israeli working class is, as it were, bought off. But that's not true, and I think Matthew made that point. Don't forget that 20% of the Israeli working class are Arabs. They're not Jewish workers. So, you know, it seems to me there's plenty of potential for a democratic movement in Israel right now, which of course is suppressed by the war. So I think we've got to keep focused on democracy and the struggle for democracy and the struggle for a democratic republic, and not simply hide it behind some general idea of a Middle East socialism, which appears to be completely abstract from where the struggle actually is.
Do you want to reply to that, Yasmin?
Yeah, I'll just say a few things on that. You see, the examples that is taken for the one-state solution is very much a reference to the end of apartheid in South Africa. And the idea then was that permanent revolution this would be the end of apartheid, and we will start a period where socialism will be achieved. There are similarities, there are also differences. The similarity, the difference, well, okay, so the main issue to point here is that, of course, apartheid was destroyed, but it had, I would say, the working class in South Africa haven't benefited from the end of apartheid, the Black working class. But there is a difference, and that difference is the way in which the colonialization by Zionists and their political economy is very different. Israel is not dependent on the work of the Palestinian working class. Yes, there is an Arab working class. I'm not calculating them as a democratic Jewish population. They're Arabs, their sympathies are very clearly with Palestinians. We can say they are Palestinians, and they consider themselves Palestinians. For example, they can't join the IDF. They need visas if they want to go, as if they've left Israel and want to go back. So it's a very different Palestinian. The Arab population of Israel is not the Israeli working class. We are talking of the Jewish working class. The overthrow of the Zionist state and the establishment of a democratic secular state is obviously a step forward, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. And from that point of view, a one-state solution is something you can aim for. But such an overthrow cannot happen from outside. As much as we wish it, this will not happen from outside. Part of the peoples that should be creating such a unified democratic state must be the Israeli working class. And here we have to ask the questions that Moshe keeps asking. What will be the benefit for the Jewish working class in Israel to call for such a solution? Given the fact that currently they are the elite of the working class. Okay, they're still under exploitation, but they are elite. They are, if you like, the aristocracy compared to the Arab working class, the Arab Israelis even. And therefore, it is how do we envisage these people to rebel and overthrow the state that is beneficial for them in alliance with what has become, whether we like it or not, 7th of October has changed the mental attitude, the mindset of the Israeli population. History will judge whether this was a mad act by Hamas or it was a very brave act. But irrespective of that, there is a solidifying position in Israel by all sections in being more hardline about Israel. The peace movement exists, the pro-Palestinians exist, but it is very limited. In those circumstances, how do we envisage a Jewish working class to unite with the Palestinians for a democratic state? Unless we say, oh, we wish it in the United Kingdom and in Europe, and it will happen because we wish it, and democracy will prevail. I can't see it. I try to think about it, but I can't see it. And as I said, from the 8th of October, I see less chance of it than I did before that. And here, the question is very different from solidarity. This is not solidarity. There are people on the days, on crucial days, when there has been reports about, for example, military attacks on Gaza hospitals, you see people rushing over the Sinai desert, walking towards the border, i.e. Egyptians volunteering to go. It's by shooting at the front of these that the Egyptian state stops the Egyptian working class walking into Gaza. It is by force that they stop it. And that is different from you and I going to a demonstration in London, in peaceful London, and showing solidarity with the Palestinians. It's a different level of engagement. It's a different level of commitment to a case. And that's, I think, makes a difference.
Thanks, Yasmin. Anne wants to have a second go.
Yeah, thank you very much for allowing me to do this. Okay, so yes, it was just about the question of solidarity and the engagement of other peoples in the region with the question of Palestine. So like with Jordan, like Yasmin already made the point that such a significant, something like 60% of the population is in fact Palestinian. So we are all Palestinian means something very different to them. And like the question I would ask is, does we are all Palestinians imply we are all of the Arab people, we are all of the Arab masses? You know, that's what people are saying if they're connecting that question to their struggle against their own regime. And then the question, like, it's interesting now that Yasmin raised that issue of the Egyptian border, because I was going to ask you about that. Because, like, you know, I hear like quite a lot of stories about it from people, Palestinians whose family are still in the Gaza and they're trying to get them out. And it's corrupt, of course, so it's whatever, 7,000 euros or 10,000 euros per person to get out. But the Guardian reported that this was happening, and now the Egyptian government sacked all the people on the border and put new people in there that apparently are incorruptible, but obviously they will be corrupt. But nevertheless, it's extremely difficult to get anybody out, and the border sounds like it's very heavily fortified. And so, and it is the only direct way out of Gaza, isn't it? There isn't any other, there's no other way except along through Israel, which is an impossibility. So I just wanted to ask you, like, what do you think is happening with that? Of course, like, Egypt doesn't want refugees, but at the same time, like, look what's happening inside in Gaza. You know, we're on the brink of mass famine already. You know, when you look at the reports on Al Jazeera and other channels, you can see how thin people are. You can see just how desperate it is. So, I mean, there's huge pressure from among its own population for action, as there is among the populations of Jordan and Syria and elsewhere. Doesn't it seem, you know, that, I don't know, it's like, to me, it's kind of hard to understand that some concession wouldn't be made, that some program would be established to allow people from Gaza to leave, which is what Israel wants. I mean, like, maybe this is a completely disconnected point, but like thinking, you know, the parallel to the situation in Ukraine, where it was like all, you know, it was quite early, wasn't it, in the whole situation that people, in terms of Europe, that the European leaders decided, you know, they were going to accept refugees, and then they came and all of the benefits, etc., they were given them, but there was a program there. I mean, there have been programs in the past. I'm only speaking about Ireland, but I imagine it must be the case in other European countries as well as in other parts of the world, that there would have been programs, resettlement programs. Of course there are. What am I talking about? Of course they're huge. Of course, what it ends up being is people being over at the other side of the border in tents, and in a situation where UNRWA, which God knows what's going to happen to that, in particular, if it's Palestine, would be assisting them. So they would be leaving. They would be leaving in one way or another, which is what Israel wants to do. So that, like, you know, I think about that. Well, what the hell is going on there? Sorry, I'm going to finish. That's it. That's me finishing. Thank you, Tina.
Thanks, Yasmin. Sorry, and your name. Yasmin, we have one more person.
Okay.
As it's almost 9 o'clock, I
Yeah.
suggest we bring her in first.
Sure.
Una, hi.
Hi,
Yeah.
good evening. Thank you, Yasmin. Just a quickie. You're saying, Yasmin, the working class Jewish family won't like what's going to be offered to them because of the 7th of October. Surely they should have been aware of that 75 years ago. It's not new. For I'm totally confused. Why should we always say, oh, we need to ask Israel first permission first? Excuse me, I was speaking to people in Ramallah today, and they only want one thing. They want their country back. That's too much asking. That's what my point.
Thank you, Una.
Thank
Yasmin,
you, Tina.
I suggest when you're summing up now, when you're replying, that you
Yeah.
might also sum up a bit. I know we didn't get to the Nasser and Palestine much.
That's
We
fine.
have to do another session.
That's fine. That's fine.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
there's also Nasser and Bassism, so we can definitely, if you wanted to, that would be
Yeah.
okay. On what Anne was saying, I think there is a pan-Arab sentiment, but I think what we are seeing is a bit deeper, is actually pro-Palestinian rather than, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay. Is more kind of very specific, very clear pro-Palestinian feelings, which goes beyond being all Arab. And in some ways, I think the overthrow of the governments of the region is part of this, because unless people can, all these Arab leaders, Nasser included, have always said, oh, if only we solved the situation in Palestine, we could deal with all your problems, your health, your lack of food, your poverty, and so on. And I think it has come to a stage where Arab people don't believe this, that don't want this. And the neighboring countries have a very close history. If you think that Palestine was part of the governorate of Damascus, if you think that the Khedive in Egypt was part of the same Ottoman Empire, when you think that a lot of these divisions were a line drawn on the sand over the Sykes-Picot Agreement, North-South divide, about who was going to be in whose protectorate, Britain or France, then you're in a situation where you understand how the plight of the Palestinians is intricately part of the whatever revolution happens in the region is part of it. And ironically, the only people who didn't have Palestine as the top priority of their demands were Daesh, Islamic State, and ISIL, whatever it was called. So I think that is the, if you like, progressive uniting force between them. In terms of what Egypt will do, okay, so there's been a lot of bribes offered to Egypt if they accept the population of Gaza. And from what I understand, and other people have told me, Egypt has said no to all of them. They included the idea that Israel would directly pay for housing in Egypt. That was one proposal from an Israeli group. There was a proposal by US, that US will allow Egypt access to this offshore oil that is on the sea, and they could use that money to house the Palestinians. This is pie in the sky, and this kind of pie in the sky is not the kind of things that anyone takes seriously, and the Egyptians have said no to that as well. They might be under Sisi, a completely corrupt authoritarian government, but they're not stupid, so they haven't. The proposals that are taken more seriously are, they're all appalling suggestions, I agree. It's forced migration of people. The ones that some people tell me, at least Middle East-centered people tell me, is taken seriously, is the idea of Tony Blair going around, I assume, to East European countries, because I can't imagine Britain or Germany facing already electorally jazzed up about tens of thousands of immigrations at accepting Palestinians, but apparently there is a proposal that the US will pay some European countries, and my guess is some East European countries, to take Palestinians. And again, an awful suggestion. And of course, the man who has paved the way for the disasters of the region is now the person being paid, I assume, to do this. None of these will work. And I think what is tragic is this hunger that might lead to much larger scale destruction of the Palestinian people than anything we have seen so far. I mean, what we have seen so far is terrible, is tens of thousands, a lot more than the 25, 26,000. Because if I understand it correctly, the US, and they're not very friendly, estimates that there is at least another 7,000 dead under the rubble. So we are talking of 30-something thousand, and there's a lot more. And given those numbers, given that kind of devastation, I think we really are looking at an even more serious humanitarian disaster, unfortunately. And there's no way that we can imagine the destruction that this is causing. In terms of Israel, I wanted to make it clear, I don't think that we should listen to what the Israeli popular opinion is, but all I'm arguing is that those who put their hope in the idea that there will be a section of the Israeli working class that will be large enough, effective enough to help the Palestinians create a single democratic secular state are wrong. There is no sign of this. There hasn't been any sign of this in the past. And after the events of 7th of October, that those terrible, at times racist views about Palestinians has hardened. And we might sit here and wish this didn't happen, but it won't change the situation. I cannot envisage at the moment a situation where the Israeli working class will rise against Zionism for the creation of a single secular state. They don't even want the two-state solution, which isn't a two-state solution, is a Bandustan solution. They're even retreating from that. But if you listen to the so-called, what I would call soft Zionist, Labour, ex-Labour Party supporters, that kind of people, they still go on about the two-state solution. But in what two states? There is nothing left of there's nothing left of a Palestinian state. What we are talking about are very small areas surrounded by settlers. And of course, Gaza is now a destroyed area. And we have these people holding conferences about what they're going to build or how they're going to move into Gaza. So in these disasters, in these terrible situations, I think you have to think realistically, and that realism is the overthrow of the Zionist state. But that overthrow requires more thought than just a slogan, a democratic secular state. It does require more in-depth analysis of what is going on amongst Palestinians, the fiasco that is going to happen, and disastrous situations do require revolutionary situations. You can't go on with the same old slogans just because you're hoping that things will become better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Excellent session, a really good discussion as well from the floor, I thought. Thank you all comrades for participating. Next week, we are looking at the relationship between America and Israel. Who's wagging the tail? Is the dog wagging the tail or the other way around? Or is it a more complicated relationship? So we have two speakers, Matthew Jones and Roger Silverman. So I hope you'll join us next week. Thank you, Yasmin. That was a great session. Brilliant. Over 100 people in the audience, so that was really good again.
Thank you very much. Thanks
Bye-bye.
for inviting. Thank you. Bye-bye.